We turn now to a very different story. After losing her husband to a heart attack, Joan Didion chronicled the devastating effects of her loss in the Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking. Soon after the book was published, her daughter, Quintana, also passed away following an extended illness. Didion updated and transformed her story in a one-woman play also called The Year of Magical Thinking, starring Vanessa Redgrave. I spoke with Miss Didion on the stage of the Booth Theater, where the play is currently being performed. Ms. Didion, both your memoir and your play are, of course, called The Year of Magical Thinking. What is magical thinking?
Well, the way we describe it in the play is if thinking. I didn't do it that succinctly in the book, but it's the kind of thinking that where you think, if I had done such and such, if I were to do such and such, I could change the outcome of that which has already happened.
Now, what are some examples of the magical thinking that you did after your husband died?
Well, I mean, most vividly to me, I found that I couldn't throw away his shoes, and then I realized, you know, when I was giving away his clothes, the shoes I couldn't give or throw out or do anything with, because, and then it occurred to me that the reason I couldn't give away his shoes, that it was such a violent reaction, was that he would need them when he came back.
And you also, I remember this is vivid too, that you wanted an autopsy done because
he might come back, right?
If it wasn't so bad,
they could fix it.
It could be fixed.
Yes.
But you also talk about, you kind of mock your tendency to want to manage things and control things. And a lot of people do that. Isn't that kind of magical thinking too?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, I had this dreamy thought that if I managed things well enough, everything would change. And of course it didn't. And of course we can't manage things that well. I mean, that was the lesson I came away from that year or two with. After going slightly crazy, I came away realizing that neither I nor anyone could totally control events. It was the illusion of control.
Magical thinking is a phrase I learned when I was reading anthropology. Primitive cultures operate on magical thinking, if thinking. If we sacrifice the virgin, the rain will come back. If I keep his shoes.
The first 4 lines in your memoir, which are also the first words you wrote after your husband's death, they appear early in the play as well. They are, life changes fast, life changes in an instant, you sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. Why the question of self-pity?
Well, it's very big in your mind because you want to avoid it, and you certainly do feel sorry for yourself. I mean, you're very focused on what you have just lost. You're not at that, in those first few moments, you're not, first few days, you're less focused on what the person who has died has just lost, because for all you think that person, if you behave and bring him and do all the right things, he will come back. But it's you who are having to go through this experience.
Can we learn anything profoundly human without having had experienced it first?
I don't think so. I mean, it's astonishing to me how much I continue to learn simply through experience. When you would think that we would be able to project, right, ourselves into other people's situations, but it turns out we have to do it ourselves.
Now, you write about grief itself, the difference between grief as we imagine it and grief as it really is. What's the difference?
Well, the one difference that struck me was that we generally think of grief when we're not in the middle of experiencing it. We think of it as a progressive thing, that it progresses, you get better every day, right? But it goes up and down, and it goes in waves, which is something everybody mentions. You know, suddenly you're doubled over by it. You might have been doing very well for several days, and you're just walking down the street, and suddenly you're bent over.
Now, you talk a lot about the vortex effect, something that you did everything you could to avoid. What's the vortex effect?
It's suddenly everything you notice, the slightest little thing will throw you into something that takes you under. And so you learn gradually to avoid all triggers.
You mean a place or a thing?
A place, a thing.
Triggers a memory, which triggers a memory, which triggers a memory.
So you're driving down the street and you're not looking left or right. You're just keeping your eyes on the traffic.
Must have been hard to avoid so many things.
It certainly was in Los Angeles when Quintana was in the hospital there for 5 weeks. So it was very hard for me to even get from the hotel to the hospital without seeing something that reminded me of her.
And you went out of your way, you would cancel appointments so that you wouldn't have to drive down a certain street.
Right. This is a whole part of the play which we kept having trouble with because I couldn't quite explain the vortex effect.
After your husband died, you read a lot of books about grief and about the grieving process, and most of which you found useless or even offensive, if I can remember correctly, except Emily Post's Book of Etiquette, 1922. Right. Why was that helpful?
Well, it was just so sensible, and also it was not only so sensible and so sensitive to what the person in grief is actually going through physically. You're cold all the time. You can't eat. Physiologically, everything has stopped. So she had these perfectly simple things to do with people who were, if you make the food and give it to them in small quantities, they will eat it. Now the reason she knew all this and was so sensitive on it was a couple of years before she wrote that first etiquette book. I think she was doing it out of grief. I mean, her son had died. These chapters on death and funerals, they're as meaningful today as they were when they were written in the 20s.
Well, the play ends with this heartbreaking photograph that's in the back of the memoir of you and John and Quintana in 1976. A much happier moment. It reminds me of one of the most heartbreaking moments in the memoir and the play, where you talk about that Christmas long ago that you spent in Honolulu with your husband and your daughter's friend. And how everything seemed so perfect that you had a sense of well-being so profound that you didn't want to go to sleep.
Right.
Are such perfect moments destined to become also our most painful moments? Because we're bound to recall them if we live long enough, when they're all gone, when what made them perfect is gone.
Well, on the other hand, we want those moments, don't we? I mean, we wouldn't give them up.
Right.
What I remember about this particular moment in that photograph is that the photographer who did it had taken a break because he wanted to come back and do even twilight, sunset light. He was shooting for people, and so he came back, and in the 45 minutes or an hour he'd been gone. I didn't realize this until I saw a print of the picture. Quintana had put on, for the first time, eyeliner.
Now you say that many people assumed that you and your husband were fierce competitors.
Yeah, this was a real fixed idea.
Why?
Because obviously sometimes one or the other of us would get better reviews or sell more copies, right? And so that seemed to suggest to people that that we would resent it.
And you're right that that idea suggests a certain lacunae in the popular understanding of marriage. It seemed to me there was a lacunae in the popular understanding of a good marriage.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, there didn't seem to be a very widespread sense that marriage is a partnership, so I kept wondering how people stayed married. I guess the answer is they don't always.
That's right, half the time at least they don't.
Yeah.
The night your husband died, you had just returned from visiting your daughter, who was in an intensive care unit in a coma.
Right.
Basically the result of having had her pneumonia misdiagnosed as the flu.
I think so.
I wonder if you ever thought or allowed yourself to think that if that mistake had not been made, your husband would not have endured the stress that apparently contributed to his heart attack, and that your daughter wouldn't have suffered the long a series of health crises that killed her.
I certainly have thought that. If I didn't allow myself to think it at first because I didn't want Quintana to wake up and ever feel that she had been responsible. But after she died, I found this thought came to me like a pretty unavoidable thought.
Well, you don't mention it in the book.
Well, the book, you see, she was still alive when the book was written, when it was published. I mean, she died. She died in August 2005, and the book was published in October, so it was already in print.
What is the difference between experiencing the death of a husband and the death of a daughter?
Well, the death of your husband, as shocking as it seems to you at the time it happens, the death of a husband or wife, is going to happen to half of us, right? It's just part of life. On the other hand, when your children die, if they're grown children, they haven't been part of your daily life for a long time. They have their own lives. And so it's a different kind of missing.
You think I'm crazy. You think I'm crazy because otherwise I'm dangerous, radioactive. If I'm sane, what happened to me could happen to you. You don't want to hear what I have to tell you. You want me to give you a good prognosis. I can't. So it's safer to think I'm crazy. Fine. That doesn't matter to me. I was crazy for a while, but I'm not now.
What do you hope the audience will take from your play? I've always hoped that it would sort of be an hour and a half that would tear them apart and then put them back together. I mean, that would move them at some level that they might not have thought of.
In the play you write that you didn't want the years after your daughter and your husband died to end.
Right.
Why not?
Because I think everybody who loses someone feels this, that they don't want the hurt to go away. They want the person still. They want it raw, so that the person is still there.
And how is it now for you?
I think the line in the play is, if we are to live ourselves, we have to let go. So I opted to live.